Welcome to the Josh Hall Web Design Show. Helping you build better websites and create a web design business that gives you freedom and a lifestyle you love.
Hey friends, welcome into the podcast. This is episode 130, and this is a very, very special episode, and it's honestly quite a bit of a different episode for this podcast. In this one, I'm going to give you a kind of a heads up. We have a very, very transparent topic and a transparent discussion in this episode because we're going to talk about how to boot imposter syndrome with one really important tactic, and that is by embracing your superpower. And I've found by embracing what you're good at and what you have interest in, and maybe even what makes you different, that is what can help you deal with imposter syndrome, which we all go through. And it's very likely you as a web designer, particularly if you're early in your journey, you're probably feeling that right now. You're probably feeling like, what am I doing in this industry? I don't know much. I'm an imposter. What am I doing here? I had all those thoughts and doubts, and I think all of us still struggle with those. But I'm here to tell you right now that it's okay. It's okay to feel like that. But more importantly, I want you to get past that. And I want you to feel confident with dealing with that. I've talked about imposter syndrome quite a few times on the podcast, but for this episode, I wanted to bring on a very special guest who is very akin to dealing with feeling like an imposter and who has had a lot of difficulties and hardships in her life that she's got through and progressed through. My guest in this episode is Crissy Maier, who is also the author of a brand new book, a children's book called The Too Tall Giraffe. I picked this up and I got in touch with Crissy because she is a very inspirational person. And when I gave you a heads up about this episode, I told you it was transparent. It's very real. And this is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart because Crissy was born with a cleft lip and a cleft palate and has dealt with a lot of surgeries and difficulties in her life that she's pushed through. And she's such an inspirational character. And for those of you who don't know, my daughter, my oldest daughter, was also born with a cleft lip and cleft palate, and she has had a heck of a journey with multiple surgeries so far in her little life so far. And we're kind of teaching her how to embrace her superpower and how to embrace what makes her different for good and how to combat the difficulties that are going to be ahead for her. So this was a really, really personal topic for me. There are some emotional parts to this. I'm going to be honest with you. So I just want to give you a heads up. This is a very different type of episode, but Crissy, gosh, what an amazing person. I'm so excited to have her on the podcast. I think you're going to get so much from this episode. She really is an incredible person, great author. I highly recommend checking her book, The Too Tall Giraffe. Check it out. It really is a great testament to how to embrace your superpower to help you boot imposter syndrome, which all translates to web design, as you're going to find out. So I'm really excited to hear how this episode helps you out. Definitely drop me a comment and drop Crissy a comment. Just go to the post, joshhall.co/130. You can drop a comment and let us know how this episode has impacted you. I'd really love to hear that. And there's going to be no special sponsor or anything on this. I usually talk about my courses. You're welcome to check that out. Just go to my website, click on courses. If I can help you out in any way, I'd love to in your web design journey. But this episode, I just want to get right to it because Crissy was so awesome. And again, this is a very different, very transparent and real type of episode that's very near and dear to my heart. And I can't wait to hear how it helps you out as well. Here is Crissy. Let's have some fun. Crissy, welcome on to the podcast. It is such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Josh. I'm excited to be here.
So we have a mutual friend in Renee Vidor who has been on my podcast a couple of times. She's the author of Measuring Up, Standing Out in a World of Comparison. And you were introduced to me from her because you are also an author and you wrote this lovely, precious book called The Too Tall Giraffe. For those watching on YouTube, I'm holding it up right now. This podcast episode is going to be a little bit different because of this topic. And I know we're going to have a conversation about basically finding our superpowers and using our differences and utilizing those as strengths and focusing on something that might make us different, but is actually a superpower. And I love that because I know you've had a very, very interesting journey in your life, which we'll dive into. And it resonated with me so much so because my daughter, similar to you, has had a lot of surgeries so far in her young little life. Bria, my oldest, who's 3, who you met before we started this call, she was born with a cleft lip and a cleft palate, and she has some developmental delays, and it's a journey with her. But I've already noticed at 3 years old, she has these superpowers that I want to encourage her to embrace. And I think that's what we're going to dive into in this talk. And I know this is going to translate to my audience of web designers, because we all suffer with imposter syndrome and feeling like we're not good enough, but we can find our superpowers. So all that to say, I'm so excited to talk with you here, Crissy. Before we dive in, would you like to let everybody know where you're based out of and what you do?
Yeah, I am based out of Long Island, New York. I am a retired NYPD sergeant who has turned into an author, a speaker, and a coach.
Awesome. Well said. Well, I can tell you've done that before because that was very concise. And I guess I would love to start, because I definitely want to talk about the book and this idea of your children's book, The Too Tall Giraffe. I think it would be worthwhile diving into the jettison of all this and kind of, if you're open to sharing as much as you'd like about kind of what you went through with your journey. Would you like to kind of share the origin of all this and what has led to this book?
Yeah, I as a kid, obviously I had the cleft lip and palate. I had all these surgeries. I also had a learning disability, which is not uncommon with cleft lip and palate. I don't know what the association is, but there sounds like there is one.
Yeah.
And so I had a lot of trouble with reading comprehension. When I was in first grade, they did testing on me, and I was able to read a couple words and spell like one word. And so really that was a big challenge for me. And I remember growing up not really liking reading, probably because it was really hard. Mm. And then one of my friends in high school gave me a romance novel, and that was sort of the end of my not liking reading. So,
that's awesome.
Yeah. So my senior year in high school, I took a reading and writing class. I mean, that's how much I changed. And I had to write a children's book, and that was the first iteration of The Too Tall Giraffe. Mm. And I always wanted to rewrite it. And it finally came to me. The time came late in 2019, and I started working on really creating this so that I could publish it. But when I think about what was going on in high school, now I've had, most of my surgeries as a child. I've gone from this, I can barely read, to enjoying reading. And I think that was when I was first starting to see obstacles turning into opportunities for me and being my strengths and my superpowers, even though I didn't recognize it at the time. And that's how this book really comes about and why I wrote it.
Well, like I said, when Renee told me about you and introduced us, she kind of filled me in on a little bit about your story and journey. And of course, it struck a chord with me immediately because of what my daughter has been through. And I just love it. First of all, it's such a pleasure to talk with you. We've been chatting for a couple months now, and I know we've been really excited to meet and to do this. And I think this is so worthwhile. Even if somebody doesn't have any sort of physical or delays or disabilities, there's still all sorts of difficulties, and sometimes it's emotional or a mentality where, particularly in web design, if you get into web design, everyone struggles with imposter syndrome, and we tend to, I feel like, focus on our weaknesses. And a lot of times, I think you just kind of hit the nail on the head there. A lot of times, whether it's a weakness or a delay or a disability or a difficulty, those can be our strengths. And I don't want to give too much of the book away, but the idea of this too tall giraffe is that while this giraffe is too tall, in the end of the story, you basically find out that this giraffe, Savannah, actually is able to use that as a superpower to protect her friends, whereas she was made fun of early on for being too tall. Suddenly, by the end, that's her superpower. She's looked at as a helper because she can, see things that other giraffes can't. So there's a lot of different ways this will translate to business. So first of all, Crissy, thanks so much for sharing that and for being open about this. Because again, I as a parent, Bria is at an age right now where she's still 3, so she's not in school, we're not doing anything like that yet, but that's going to come before we know it. And I really want to focus with the same thing on her. What is her superpowers? So I guess one of the first questions is, how do you identify what your superpowers are? Is that something that you'll learn over time? Have you learned any tips or tricks, especially for kids, to zone in on what they're interested, like how to find their superpower?
Yeah, I think the first place to look is the place where you least expect it to be. So that place where you are different, the place that separates you, is the first place to look for it. And it's not always obvious there, but you feel it. One story I love, a couple of years ago, it occurred, it just came to me, and I realized I'd been living it my whole life. And in third grade, playing kickball, I was always like one of the last kids picked. And you stand on that line with a classmate picking the strongest kids, and you know you're going to be at the end of that. And it doesn't feel good. But this one day, I come up at bat and I'm going to do a bunt, because that was my best hope for making it to first base. And my bunt kind of fails, and the pitcher gets it. And when he throws the ball at me, it ends up going over my head. And that's how I end up. And I get on first base and everybody cheers. And I can remember that moment and knowing that it was because I was short. And that's always been, it's being short is a pain when you're trying to get stuff off of high shelves and stuff. But that's a part of who I am. And that's like what I channel in myself. I don't try to be the biggest, the tallest, because that's not who I am. So if I find my power in being a shorter, more petite woman, that gives me the power to do things. In the NYPD, I had a conversation with somebody about going to ESU. And in the end, I didn't have any interest in going. But, people think of ESU, it's like a SWAT team. They think big burly guys taking down doors. But there's a lot of finesse that goes with it. Not everything is taking down doors. Some stuff is getting into small spaces, using your brain to find solutions to things. And so, I wasn't going to get in to be taking down doors, but there might have been room for me if I wanted to go that route, if I'd leveraged this idea of being small and having an education and understanding how to find solutions to problems.
That's beautiful. That's so well said. And it gets my mind going about how we're going to guide Bria, because she is so small. She's 3 years old. She's only 20 pounds. She's just a little peanut. And I know there was one situation, and I talked about this with Renee when she was on the last time. We were like going to a pizza place, and we were just waiting for tables, and this little kid just kind of looked at her, and kids, there's zero filter. They just say whatever they're thinking. And he was just like, "Why are you so small?" And like, obviously Bria doesn't talk yet or anything. So I didn't even know what to say. He was just curious. So we're really thinking through acknowledging that, but not focusing on that, and not necessarily making that a bad thing. And that little comment really made me think like, okay, number one, what am I going to say? He didn't mean anything bad by it. But number two, how are we going to teach Bria to look at this and how to use this? Like, I'm sure it's not something you just want to pass over like it's not true, but you don't want to focus on that as a negative. And I do want to relate this to business for everyone listening who might wonder if this relates to them. If there's something that you're not good at, for example, for me, I've always been terrible with numbers. I've always been terrible at math. I hate math. So the fact that I'm a business owner and an entrepreneur still baffles me, because in high school, if you would have told me that I was going to be running two different businesses, and I got a D in typing, so the fact that I blog and do this for a living is insane. But the trick is I basically get by. I learned enough and try to make it fun, like you did with reading. And I've learned to basically just do enough and then hire other people to do the stuff that I don't want to do or I'm not good at. But all that to say, I didn't focus on the fact that I was bad at math and hated it to deter me from doing what I love now. And I want everyone to have that same idea with whatever you might find difficult or whatever sets you back. So I guess the next question I have for you, Crissy, is how do we, in the case of like my daughter with somebody telling her she's small, how do we acknowledge that, but turn the focus from a negative to a positive?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I was just working on something with that earlier today. And it's, my parents always told me good things come in small packages and, all that stuff. And now as an adult, I actually believe that.
Oh, yeah.
But I think you have to find those little key places where it becomes a benefit. And it's just, and for everybody, it's going to be different. But if we only, if you talk to kids who are too tall, which I have done now quite a bit because I wrote a book called The Too Tall Giraffe, but they always talk about having trouble finding clothes.
Yeah.
They talk about, people think, oh, they're going to play basketball and they have no interest in it. So there's a lot of assumptions that come on both sides of this. But there's always a sweet spot for somebody. And so for somebody small, it's, you're not going to be the most athletic kid probably on the field. That doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to be good at what you do. Maybe you can be the faster runner. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be, I was never going to kick the ball into the outfield. So you just focus on the things that you do well, just like in business, just like you were talking about. Focus on those things and grow those strengths over time. And it is your superpower. And you'll find these things all over in life every day. They just come about over time.
Yeah. Would you say a good word to kind of track the journey and the progress and track your superpowers would be intentional? Because when you were saying that, I felt like what I've learned in my journey is I've had to intentionally realize what I'm good at and what I really enjoy. And what I realized in my journey was I was a pretty good designer. I wasn't the best designer in the world by any means. I could get by with coding and website stuff, but it took me 3 times longer to be able to figure out coding, whereas some other folks were doing it, way faster than I was. Again, the math, the numbers, not my strong suit, but I can get by. But what I did realize as I progressed in my journey, in my professional career, was that overall I loved teaching. Anytime I got to teach, I always felt like I was in my zone. That was an area that I never knew I had in me when I had some opportunities to do presentations and to teach. So I knew I loved teaching. The other one was I found myself to be a really good connector. I always loved, like Renee did with us. She was like, you should meet my friend Crissy. And I always loved that too. I'd meet somebody and be like, you should talk to my friend John or you should talk to Amy or whatever. You guys would hit it off. I found out that I really, a knack for that. And then I realized overall, I just loved helping people in business in different areas. So now I'm fortunate to do all three in what I do here with my podcast and my courses and stuff. And I did a lot of that as a web designer. But I say all that to say that's kind of in a nutshell how I realized what my superpowers are is as I was doing other things and growing in my journey in business and personal development, I kind of intentionally looked at what I really enjoyed and what I was really good at and tried to, basically make a career out of those. I guess to your point, is that kind of how you teach kids and other folks, particularly young adults? Because it's tough when you're in high school and college, early college, you're still growing. You're still becoming, you don't know who you are quite yet. Is intentional a good word to kind of keep track of your journey and figuring out what these superpowers are?
Yeah, I think intentional and also being aware. So I think, as a dad, when you're looking at Bria, what things bring her joy? What puts a smile on her face? Looking for those things. Where does she stand up taller? And those are things that she's going to do subconsciously when she's enjoying things and has that confidence. And those are the things that you want to kind of, I don't want to say push, because I don't think you want to push kids, but focus on maybe.
I like that. Yeah.
And I think as an adult, being aware of how you feel doing things, when you're doing something, you hate doing it. Sometimes as a business owner, you have to do it anyway. But now you know that when you have the money, you can hire somebody else to do it. You can do that. And the things that you really enjoy are the things that you want to try to keep for yourself, at least, as long as you can until you can hire somebody else to do them, because it makes sense for a business.
Oh my gosh, that's such a good point, Crissy. And as I don't know, it's funny because your website is Divi, which is the tool I use. I'm not sure if you did any website work yourself or if you hire that out. Did you do any website tinkering yourself?
I can do some tinkering. I had somebody design this one and I can tinker with it. I can design a bad website on my own.
Gotcha.
And I can tinker somebody else's much better website on my own. And that's about it.
Gotcha. Well, the reason I ask is because as a web designer, there are so many different things that come into play that you didn't realize you signed up for. Most web designers think, I'd love to design sites and help somebody have a nicer site and grow their business. That sounds great. Well, what they didn't realize is they also signed up for being the salesperson and being the project manager and being the tech support and doing email and all this other stuff. So I realized early on, again, going back to being intentional, and I love that you back that up with being aware, because I think that is a big one too. I was very aware that the tech stuff is going to take me longer to figure out. I could figure it out, but it just takes me longer. And I've realized now as an entrepreneur, and I'm quicker to hire work out, I definitely hire out as much as I can to just free up more life-giving type of tasks that I'm well suited for. Early on, I think it is good to do a lot of that stuff. But yeah, I agree. As soon as you get a chance or you can partner up with somebody or hire that out, that is huge, because it does, I guess, one deterrent from finding your superpower is doing stuff that you feel like you're quote unquote supposed to do, or somebody would push you to, right? I'm sure that's something that people struggle with a lot, is they could bypass their superpower by focusing on stuff that they shouldn't focus on, or maybe somebody else is telling them what to do.
Oh yeah. I mean, all the time we're all focusing on the things that we don't like, the bad comment, the bad review on a book, all those things tend to polarize in our brains for whatever reason, and not the things that are supportive to us, the things that feel good, that the wins. So we have to be intentional about that. And when those things don't feel good, it's okay to say, I don't like that. That's not my superpower, and I can find another way to do it.
That is good. And it's tricky too, isn't it? Because sometimes, like you said, sometimes as a business owner, you do have to do stuff that you just don't want to do.
Yeah.
I do think there's a difference between doing something you don't want to do and also, beating your head against the wall on something that is just not your skill set, not your strong suit, or something that maybe you don't need to do. That's definitely something I've learned over time, that if it's something that's going to take me 5 hours to figure out and somebody could do it in half an hour, let's save that 5 hours and hire it out. Or in some cases, if I'm going to work on something really hard and get through it, I know next time I'm either going to do this a different way or have some help or something like that. I think that's a very valid point in just life in general, and obviously, of course, business, because it is kind of tricky when you want to do something all yourself. And I think a lot of web designers just like to do everything ourselves, but I do think it's such a valid point, because we might be maybe not neglecting a superpower, but we might be keeping that dormant because we're focusing on so many things that we shouldn't do. And going back to this point of somebody else kind of writing your story, this is something that I really, really struggled with in high school, because at the end of high school, my guidance counselor in particular made me feel like crap because I didn't want to go to a 4-year college degree. I just didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I definitely didn't want to go hundreds of thousands of dollars into debt. And she literally, unintentionally or not, made me feel like I was going to live on the streets if I didn't go to college. And it's just not what I wanted to do. Thank God I didn't listen to her. And I'm sure she didn't have any concept of entrepreneurship or something like that. So I really had to to be honest, Crissy, like I personally felt like a bit of a failure and a bit of a lower class kind of person because I didn't want to go to college, and I didn't want to go that route. I was a cabinet maker. I was a drummer in a rock band. Started to get into design. So my path into web design and what I do now is well, actually quite common for entrepreneurs, but very different for academics. So I say all that to say, had I let her dictate my path and I went into a 4-year degree, I would not be where I am right now, and I wouldn't probably be talking to you. I wouldn't have this podcast. Is that, I guess, I mean, it's more of an example, but what do you tell people, and kids especially, when they're trying to figure out their own path and people are telling them to do stuff a certain way?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. It's hard because the school guidance counselor, you don't live with them. You don't have to do what they say, even though it may feel like you're supposed to. But it's different when it's your parents who want you to do something and they're paying the bills. And sometimes then you do have to, conform at least to some level. But also part of that is proving yourself in this other area. Just because you go to college or you get a job doesn't mean that you can't play with these other things on the side. I wrote my first book while I was working. And this book, I mean, I've retired now, so I'm in a different situation than a lot of other people. But you can be a writer, you can be a web designer on the side and build up some of your business, build up a client base, and prove yourself to the guidance counselor, your parents, your wife, your husband, whoever you need to prove that that is a viable way to go. You can do that.
That's a great point. I'm so glad you said that, because it does make me think, maybe had I gone that route, maybe if I did go the 4-year college degree academic route, maybe I would have had something on the side. I'm sure I would have. The entrepreneurial spirit's been in me from day one, so I probably would have done something. But that's a great point. I could definitely see, I definitely see the difference between, like you said, a guidance counselor and parents who are paying for it or whatever. That, for me, fortunately, I had parents that were very supportive, although I'm sure they were like, oh, I prefer him to go to college, but let's see what happens. I mean, they expressed their concern at times, but I love that point, Crissy. I think that's so important, particularly for folks who are in a situation where they may not have full control of their lives financially and stuff, so they can't just do everything that they want right then. Look, that's an important point too. Like, I couldn't do what I'm doing right now back then because I've learned a lot in business and was able to craft this career and build a name as an authority as a web designer. That takes time, though. I think a lot of times freedom in business takes a lot of time, and it seems like people just need to have more patience. Delayed gratification is a really big term that I think needs to be just shouted from the mountaintops now, because I don't want to be like kids these days, but it does seem like everyone wants everything right now. And maybe that's because Amazon gives us our packages within 24 hours. But I feel like delayed gratification is a big one. So I totally agree with that, because would you say, particularly when it comes to somebody kind of orchestrating a path for somebody, if it's parents or whatever, so we don't want to limit those superpowers, but would you say you're still able to do a lot of that and, find your superpowers along the way? I mean, I imagine you can mix both and do both.
Yeah. And it's going to depend on the circumstances. I mean, I grew up, my parents didn't go to college. They, graduated high school, they got jobs, and they did fine for themselves. They sent 3 girls off to college, with no loan. So they did great for themselves and for me and my sisters. So I grew up never thinking not going to college was an option. And, do I need a college degree for what I'm doing now? Maybe, maybe not, but it didn't hurt me either. And I did spend a lot of time in college taking different classes and learning about myself and dealing with people. So there's always lessons there if you're looking for them. So, everybody has a different amount of leeway with it.
That's good. Yeah.
But if you have somebody who's like, you're going to be a doctor, and that's like the only, that's a tough position. It doesn't mean there aren't other options. But I read a book a couple months ago, The Third Door, and that was actually, I think, why I'm thinking of the doctor. I can't think of the author's name right now, but his parents want him to be a doctor. They were not happy when he dropped out of school, but I think they're pretty happy with what he's doing now. So
Alex Banayan. But yeah, that looks good. I'm going to add this to my book list here. Yeah. And I really feel for folks who are in that position where you have maybe overbearing parents who expect you to go to a certain path. And I think that's cultural too in a lot of cases where certain cultures just expect kids to follow a certain suit, or in some families, it's the family business or whatever. I know that's very, very tricky. It's one thing my wife and I have talked about with, when we open up the door to our daughters and future kids, we're going to keep on continuing having kids, hopefully. We want to make sure we don't limit them in any way to focus on their superpowers and just kind of show them, what options are available. I'm not against college. I have a lot of reservations on higher education just based off my experience and a lot of the people I work with. However, if there is an industry they want to go into and college is the best route, then I'm certainly going to support that. I'm never going to say, don't go to college. It's a waste of time and money. But if they want to be an entrepreneur, I'll probably tell them that. Now, I agree. You can still get a lot of benefit from college. But I guess I say all that to say I'm really thinking through, like, how are we going to frame these opportunities to our little ones at that time to make sure they know what is available, to not limit them, and I love what we're talking about right now with being intentional and aware, because I think my wife and I will continue just to kind of see what their superpowers are, and really kind of take that and use it as a kind of a freedom tool for them to pick where they want to go. I would love to shift this talk to comparison. We talked a little bit about imposter syndrome. I felt it big time. I'm sure everyone feels it in all industries. In web design, it seems to be really prevalent because it is a creative type of field. And a lot of people who get into web design tend to, particularly from other industries, they may not feel like they're a good designer, or they don't feel like they're trendy enough, or, they come from like a blue collar background and like, how can I be a designer if I was in my case, a cabinet maker? Obviously, I'm sure this is something you've dealt in your journey, in your life, Crissy, at a whole nother level. But yeah, let's talk about comparison. I'm trying to think of the best way to kind of phrase this first question, but I guess, what are some of the tips that you've learned in your journey as somebody who has probably faced the fiercest amount of either not judgment, but comparison? Because again, my daughter, I think I said this before we went live, we see all the charts of what's quote unquote normal or average, and she's below everything. Like, in some cases, she's like negative on some of these charts. And we've really had to realize comparison for Bria, in my case of my daughter, it's different for her because she just has some of these delays and disabilities, and we can't look at that and expect it to be the same for her. So yeah, and on the idea of comparison, what are some tips for combating that and helping with that?
Well, I think especially in the creative space where everybody is in a different spot. Everybody has a different focus. You have to focus on what you're doing and the change that you're making for people. My website, I don't know if, I'm sure there's better ones out there. There's worse ones out there. But it's if you saw what I had before, it's so much better. So when we compare ourselves to ourselves, we see progress. Mm-hmm. One thing that I do is I keep a daily, weekly, and monthly and annual tracking or journal, whatever you want to call it. And every month at the end of the month, I go through it and write down all of my wins for the month. And at the end of the month, I'll be like, I don't remember what I did and what I accomplished. And when I go through that sheet, I'm like, wow, I did a lot. And so sometimes when you feel like you're spinning your wheels, you're getting nowhere, the website didn't come out right, whatever doesn't feel like it's going right, when you go back and look at all the things that you accomplished in a 30-day period, you'll be amazed. And I think comparison of other people isn't fair to yourself. Comparison to yourself shows you the progress that you're making. And as a web designer, look at websites you made a year ago and look at what you made now. Yeah. And I bet you'll be like, oh, wow, I'm doing much better.
Oh my gosh, Crissy, that's such a good point. That is, I love that because, yeah, particularly in a creative field, if you judge yourself and compare yourself against really great designs, of course you're going to feel like a nobody, or you're going to feel like, you're not cut out for this, because that design is probably chock full of decade or years of experience. And oh my gosh, I can't agree more. If you compare against yourself, even just a small incremental self-improvement, or in the case of design, like little improvements of design, you really can look back and think, wow, this project looks completely different than it did 30 days ago, or this website that I did this month is so much better than I did last month. That is what's to focus on. And I love that. I cannot echo that enough to combat imposter syndrome. And that's, interestingly enough, I guess I didn't really think about it like this, but that's kind of what we realized with Bria is we don't really look at other kids her age to see where she's stacking up. We look at her and look at how much improvement she's made. And the littlest things for her, which might be nothing for some other kids, for her are huge. Like when she started walking, it was, we were like celebrating. We were like, let's get some cake. Let's pop some champagne. This is amazing. For other kids, it's like, all right, they're walking now. Cool. So I just love that, because from a business standpoint, professional standpoint, but also personally, that is so the way to go. And I even think about this same type of this approach with like weight loss and stuff like that. If you compare yourself to somebody who's shredded or is like a perfect figure, of course you're going to feel like crap. But if you do just a little bit, cut back on what you're eating and do a little bit of working out, within 30 days, you might look back at yourself a month ago and be like, wow, I took some pounds down. I feel better. That is so the way to go in every area of life. I love that. Any other thoughts on comparison and imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I think, we all have it at some point in some way with something. And so when you're having those moments, know that you're not alone. And just listen to that voice and then tell it to shut up. Acknowledge it, because it's there. It's, it's a part of you. You don't want to just pretend it's not there, because it is. But that may also tap into things like your superpowers or what's not your superpower, depending on what it's saying. I just went out this weekend to do a street fair. And I was like, I'm driving there. And I'm like, this is a waste of time. I'm not going to sell any books. There's people are going to think I'm weird who brings, books to a street. Like, I had all of these things. And when I went, it was fine.
Oh, awesome.
That's just that thing trying to keep you back. And if you let it, then it wins. When you get past it, that's when you win. That's when you grow. That's when the website gets better. That's when you lose weight. That's when all those little things happens, is when you push through it.
Well, I love that. We're always our own worst enemy, aren't we? Like, we just build these things up where it's like, oh, I'll never be able to do this, or it's going to be terrible. It's going to be a waste of time. Then more often than not, it's always great. And I feel like, and maybe this is just a human thing, but I feel like we always often, when we're in that state, we feel like everyone's against us, and we feel like people are thinking about us or wanting us to fail. The reality is, most people aren't thinking about us. We're thinking about ourselves. Like, you just have to do it. And I think this particular topic is really important with sales and lead generation and getting out there, because I know a lot of web designers, and I've heard a lot of people basically close the door off on themselves before they even try to go through it. Like, they'll be like, I'm not going to go to that networking group. I'm never going to get any leads. It's not going to be worthwhile. Well, maybe they just hurt themselves, because there could have been some really good leads there. It could have opened the door. Like, there really is a point where we kind of have to get past ourselves. And I do feel like there's a quote I heard a while back that I love, which is, your worst fears lie in anticipation. So it's that drive to the fair or whatever that's always like the worst, because you imagine all worst possible scenarios. I think this is really common for folks who start their business or are about ready to go full time. They're like, oh my gosh, am I going to fail? Am I going to end up on the streets? All these worst case scenarios, but you really do have to push through it. I guess this is a good opportunity to ask, do you have any tips or tricks on kind of quieting that side of your mind? Do you take it in and just brush it off and go? Or I kind of have my own ideas on this, but what do you do when those thoughts come in? How do you combat those?
So some days I just have to keep driving. sometimes it helps to write it down and journal it. And what it's doing is then it's putting it someplace else. And then you can sort of free yourself of it instead of letting it sit in your brain, keep you going through that, negative record. And sometimes you have to say, is there really a reality in there? Because once in a while there is like a truth in there that you're not ready for something. And when you do find that, that's okay, because that tells you where you have a weakness that you need to build up. And that doesn't mean that you can't do it, but maybe now is not the right time. But 95% of the time, that's just the devil trying to keep you from succeeding. And
I agree, yeah.
I think the other most important thing is think about who's going to benefit and how are they going to benefit. Because like for me, my book isn't about me. Like I already, I went through school and I've learned these lessons, and I still need to reinforce them sometimes. But this is for the Brias of the world, the little kids who haven't lived it, who don't know it. That's who the story is for. It's not for me. So if I'm going there and I'm worried about what the other vendors are thinking and this person and the weather, and that's me. That's not about the person who I want reading the book.
That idea and that concept in itself is so valuable, particularly in business and in sales, because if you go to a networking group or a sales meeting or like a business to business meetup and you're focused on, am I going to get any clients, or is this going to be a waste of time? How is this going to benefit me? It's likely not going to go well. And it's going to be very clear that you're focused on yourself. Whereas if you go there and on the way you get those negative thoughts, but you think, I've got some valuable services and I really want to help some people. Who could I help? Like how many businesses here could use my services and how can I help them? That's it. That will change everything. And I'm sure you have to have that same mindset with a book, right? It's like, I'm sure you didn't write the Too Tall Giraffe thinking, how many copies can I sell? I know that it was, how many people could I help and who could benefit from this, right?
Yeah, it's about getting the message. It's not about, physical books or money. If I get the message out, I think the rest will follow. I hope the rest will follow. But I can't focus on book sales as in dollars. I need to think about books as in books in hand.
Yeah.
Because I'd rather make less money and have 1,000 books go out than sell 20 books and make more money on them.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think it kind of all goes back to this idea of comparison and imposter syndrome, especially when it comes to numbers. I think a lot of entrepreneurs get into business and we're inundated with, quote unquote, successful entrepreneurs who are making 7-figure incomes, and it seems so daunting and so overwhelming. But would you back me up in saying that no matter what we're doing in life, it's the small incremental steps and progress that really boosts us up and keeps us going?
Yeah, it's interesting. Every now and then you meet, that actual overnight success. And I think those people, from what I find, have a lot more of the imposter syndrome because they never had those incremental successes where they got to build up their confidence. Whereas the person who has those small incremental steps over time and builds up, once they sort of hit that mark, a lot of those other pieces have come together for them. And so when they're speaking about it, when they're helping other people, that confidence comes off. Whereas the person who has that overnight success, they probably have a lot more questions about where it came from. Like, was it luck? Was it me? Was it that one connection that made it blow up for me? And it's not about them and their skills. And so it makes it harder for them to sell, whatever their idea they're selling.
Yeah, I feel like I've always equated it to like basically like muscle memory. Like as you become a business owner and you go through so many struggles and hardships, it really does create like this kind of like this business muscle that is going to give you confidence, and little failures along the way tend to be like the best learning situations, and those breed confidence, and more importantly, they show you what not to do or how to rebound from stuff, which is so valuable. It's all like building a strong foundation. I kind of was trying to think of the best analogy for something like that. I guess what comes to mind is like if you were to build a house on a very weak foundation, it's not going to go well. But if you build that foundation first and build on top of that, that's where longevity lies. And that's where I think more important than anything, like life balance, that's where that really comes into play. And I think just from a mental health perspective, I think you're much more apt to do things balanced in both professional and personal endeavors because you have a strong foundation. So I totally agree. I think it's those little challenges and failures that, build that muscle. And as long as, I think kind of to our point, as long as you can get through them and get out of your own way, they can be incredibly valuable. And I would love to ask you, because I know from your perspective, Crissy, in your journey, I'm sure you've gone through a lot of different seasons where there's been negativity, whether that's internal or outternal or external coming towards you. What are some of maybe some things you've learned with dealing and getting through negativity, particularly when it comes from like peer pressure and other people?
Yeah. One thing I've learned to do is, during tough times, be like, there's a lesson here. I don't know what the lesson is. I don't particularly care at the moment what the lesson is, but I know there's a lesson. And what I found when I do that is that the lows aren't as low because there's this little piece of hope that in the struggle is a win. Even though I don't know what it is and I don't care what it is, I know at some point there'll be something there. And that I found really helpful. And I think it also allows me to focus on finding what that win is when I'm ready.
That's a great point. I was just thinking from a standpoint of like, let's say you're in a place in business where you're just not getting any leads or your proposals aren't converting. That can be a very, very low point for a lot of folks. A lot of people want to quit right then or call it or whatever. And I think that mindset of not getting so low that you just blow everything up, but you look at, okay, what are the problems here? Let's use this as a learning lesson. Oh my gosh, that's such a great point. You're giving me such good like little snippets. Every question is like its own perfect little snippet, by the way. This is awesome because I feel like every answer is perfectly crafted to some questions that have not been that great in some cases. So I love that. I couldn't agree more. But when did you start thinking like that? I mean, was that like, at a certain age where you started going through some of these experiences and realizing some of that? Was it like high school, college age? When would you say some of that mindset started for you?
I think it probably started much more recently than that. There was times when I think maybe I was kind of doing it in some subconscious way. But when I started writing for myself, and started getting to just learning more about mindset and how to sort of control it ish. These were just little things that I started doing and realized that they were helping. It just, I don't know. I think some of it, I can look back to even, the kickball story from elementary school. Like, I wasn't actively going, oh, I'm short. That's my superpower.
Right.
But I felt it within me. And so I think there's a lot of things that we're all doing subconsciously that are helping us, and sometimes that aren't.
Yeah.
When we find those things, we really need to pull them out and do them even better, improve them.
That's great. Something you hit on early on was the idea of, you hated reading and were, had to push through some of these delays and stuff. But then it turned for you when the romance novel came into play and you're like, oh my gosh, I actually love this. It's so funny because I always felt the same way. Hated math and I did not like reading. I never enjoyed reading. I never read through high school. I don't actually know if I read a full book through high school. It wasn't until I'm trying to think of when I really started enjoying reading. Funny enough, it was like some business books that I actually really turned me on to some reading, and then some other kind of stuff that I've never been like a fiction type of person. I actually, the stories, I'm sure there are some books that I love as far as that are story driven, but once I had a need for it, and once I realized nobody was grading me on this, or I didn't have to read a certain amount of words per minute, or I didn't have to do a homework assignment, that's when I started actually enjoying reading. And it made me think about your situation with the romance novel and stuff too, because similarly, it just took me reading some stuff on my own accord that really was like, oh, this is cool. I'm enjoying this. And now I love reading. Now I love learning. And learning is one of my favorite things now. Whereas in high school, it seems like when you're told to do it, you enjoy it less, and it seems more arduous. I remember, I think it was like maybe my sophomore year in high school, my biggest fear over public speaking or anything was being asked to read something in class, because I didn't read that much. I just didn't, I got by. I don't know if I had any clinical or official delays, but I was not a great reader, and it took me a while. And I remember one time particularly, I was called to read like a couple pages, and I didn't do it very well. I was kind of stuttering a little bit. It was like a nightmare for me. But now I love that. And I think it's a very worthwhile point that sometimes something that you may have hated, whether it's in school or other seasons of life, you might actually really enjoy if you kind of do it your own way. Are there any other things like that you learned to take for kind of a negative and turn them into a positive, or maybe something that you love now that maybe you hated before?
You know what? I never liked working out. And we got a treadmill when I was much younger, and it made sense to put it in one spot in the room, but logistically, but then it was under bookshelves, and I was like, well, anybody who goes on it deserves to have the bookshelves fall on them. It was like my two worst worlds together. But I love to work out now. I feel good. I feel invigorated by doing it. And it's just become me making it a habit, me committing to it to the point where I'm like, I didn't work out today. How did I miss that? Like, it feels like it's missing from my day. So I think sometimes you have to experiment with what you like to do. Like, working out it could be running, it could be walking, it could be, doing weights. There's 100,000 ways to work out. You just have to find the way that works for you.
That's good. Yeah. Yeah, that same here. I hated working out in high school and stuff. And then all of a sudden, once I started doing it, making a habit, kind of the same thing. I was like, oh, actually, I didn't run recently, or I kind of missed this. So I totally agree. It's funny, like reading, I don't know if I'll ever like numbers or math. I don't think that one will ever come around for me, but reading and working out, that kind of stuff definitely turned around for me. It is kind of interesting once you're in different places in life, how something that you may have hated as a kid, you actually really enjoy as an adult or a young adult. That's kind of fascinating. I'm sure there's some interesting psychology behind that, but this all again translates to business, because something that you may think you're never going to be good at, or you never enjoyed, you might actually really enjoy if you get a chance and kind of do it in your own way. So that's a very valid point. I love that. I'm curious, Crissy, do you have siblings, or are you an only child?
I have two older sisters.
Okay. And did they have any sort of cleft palate or anything like that?
No.
Yeah. So same thing for Bria. What was interesting, because so we have her little sister Annie, who's at the time of recording this 1.5. She's already, heavier than Bria. She's already, speaking more and doing everything. So what's kind of interesting is I think she kind of looks like the older sister now. So that's kind of one thing, especially when it comes to comparison, is we're trying to, which I think it's great for Bria, because she has somebody who's like her best friend, who's kind of like showing her how to do stuff now. And I think it's helping Bria be more expressive and learn faster and stuff. But I was curious, when it comes to having somebody that's that close to you, who is bigger and maybe is doing stuff faster, how do you learn from that, but not let that deter you? I was curious from like your perspective, if they were doing stuff at sooner ages than you were, do you think that helped you learn faster, and how do you use that as like inspiration and not, something that's going to, make you feel worse because you're not learning something as fast?
Yeah. My middle sister, she was the smart one. And like, I guess I never tried to be smart like her, but I think over time I've learned that we have very different types of strengths and weaknesses. But I can't help but think that her being smart sort of encouraged me to work harder. I mean, she was also a very hard worker. I know there's some people who are just like super naturally smart and you're just like, they're freaks. Where did these people come from?
Yeah. And then you're like, if only you worked hard, you'd be unstoppable.
Yeah. And then me, I'm like busting my butt and I'm like still getting only halfway where they are. But my sister did work hard. So I think that probably helped with my work ethic towards getting things done.
Well, that's funny because my brother was the same way. I have one younger brother who's about a year and a half younger. He is very book smart. And this was something I struggled with in high school in particular. We were actually in the same math class for 1 year. I wouldn't advise that for school systems because it definitely makes the older person feel like, wow, I'm definitely not smart enough. I'm in a grade below with my brother. But what was funny is he was like book smart, but he wasn't that hard of a worker. He just knew stuff. And I remember particularly there was like one test where he didn't study at all and he got like an A, and I studied my freaking ass off and I barely got a C. So it was that same thing where it was like, man, my brother, if only you really put your hard work into this, you'd be amazing, which he's a hard worker and stuff. But it was just particularly in those high school years, it did seem like there were people who just got stuff. And that did kind of mess with me a little bit because I always felt like I had to work extra hard. Although taking a weakness and putting it into a strength, I think that taught me a lot about hard work. And there's something to be said for working really hard and even getting a C, but feeling like, well, at least I didn't fail. I learned a lot and I tried my darndest. It's kind of a springboard to doing the next thing. I do think there's a lot of value from a work ethic standpoint with that. And a term I like to use for any entrepreneur is the value of this like figure outiveness. Like just if you figure it out, it's so valuable. So I was just curious from your perspective how you kind of deal with that, because that's one thing we're already facing now with Bria and Annie, my daughters. Is Annie, being a year and a half younger, is doing a lot more than Bria is, but we're trying to kind of show Bria that this is good. Like, don't let this deter you, or don't let this make you feel bad because you're older and you're not doing this. But hopefully it's going to work itself out like that, and we can teach her to focus on the strengths that she does have. So I love that. Any other thoughts on that, particularly when people are like closer to you and maybe you're just either behind or making sure that doesn't, derail you or deter you from your strengths?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me has always been, I always felt like if I worked hard, I would figure it out. And sometimes I was just going to have to work harder than other people. And, those other people who things came easier for, they were going to have an issue somewhere else. Maybe they were going to hit the wall at some point and they wouldn't know what to do with it. And I'd be like, oh, another wall. Like, how do I get around this one? I would just always find another solution. Whereas I think some people, when it's a little bit easier, when they hit that wall, it's like they crumble.
Oh, that's a great point. I feel like there's also gratitude there where somebody who works really hard, in their spirit and in their soul, they just feel more fulfilled and they feel more grateful. Whereas somebody who it just comes natural, there's often this just like kind of air of like ungratefulness maybe or something. I don't know, that just is very unappealing and unattractive. And it makes me think of like I'm a big hockey fan. So there's a lot of players who are just naturally gifted and bigger dudes who I often see interviews with them, and it just seems like they're not embracing the reality and just the amazing fact that they're like in the NHL and making millions of dollars playing hockey. Whereas some of the little guys who work their butts off and make it to that level, they're like fired up. You can tell, like you can see it in their eye that they are just they're living life to the fullest, being able to do this. And I think that's a really valuable point. And I think the same translates to business, in that maybe somebody who it just comes natural, maybe doesn't understand how amazing it is to be in that type of situation where, like, for me, because I've worked so hard to get here, every day I'm like, I can't believe I get to do this. Like, this is awesome. This is amazing. Now, granted, this wasn't luck. I've worked really hard to get here, but I definitely feel a sense of fulfillment that I think a lot of other colleagues in the same realm don't seem to have. Is that something you've seen as well?
Yeah, I think you also see it in how they celebrate victories. I'll bet you celebrate all your little victories a lot more, even if it's just, like giving yourself a high five for those little things, in private. But when you have to overcome things, you feel that win in a way that the other person doesn't. And I think that's something to sort of look for when you're working with other people, and, are they, the right kind of people you want to have on your podcast or do a seminar with, or whatever the case is. And you want to find those people who are like you. I think that's one of the places you look. How do they celebrate their wins?
That's so true. That's great. Yeah. We're a celebration family. We celebrate everything. And oh my gosh, when it came to my daughter, I think I told you, or maybe Renee told you, we spent 2 months in the NICU with her. Man, when we got out, it was like, it's hard to explain that feeling of like, wow, just to be home. Like, it is weird. Sometimes when you go through situations in life, it makes you not take for granted just the simplest stuff, like just being able to be home with our daughter. And then she had an NG tube for a long time, for months. And for anybody who's not familiar, it's basically a tube that goes up through your nose. You have to tape it on the kid's face. I put that in her nose all the time. I mean, I don't ever want to relive that. I got really good at it. I probably would have been a pretty good nurse, but I did not ever want to do that again. And poor thing. I hated doing that to her because she had failure to thrive, which is basically where kids just, they're not going to support themselves. They need help with food. Luckily, we never had to go the G-tube route. We were really, really close with Bria, but she ended up doing enough on her own, and we really worked with her to where she could feed herself. But anyway, I say all that to say, when she was able to drop the tube, it was like, what? We're home. She doesn't have a feeding tube right now. The thing that an average, family with a kid with no feeding disabilities, you don't even think about, you take it for granted. It's amazing. It's amazing that we don't have to deal with that. So when we had our second with Annie, she felt like nothing. It was like, she doesn't have, we don't have to go to 3 appointments, doctor's appointments a week. She doesn't have feeding problems. It was literally like, it felt like nothing. It was like, this is too good to be true. So I say all that to say there is so much value in these hardships, because they do seem to make those little wins in just everyday life seem that much more gratifying, right?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's a really important mindset to have. And even for folks who may not be going through stuff like that, or even just in business, even if you're not going through a lot of lows, I think sometimes just imagining and just taking a step back and thinking about, wow, how grateful you should be to be in this situation, even particularly for web designers working from home. Like, I personally feel like we are, despite all the political crap and stuff going on in the world, we are still in it's an amazing time to be alive. The fact that pretty much anyone can work from home if they want to, depending on what industry you're in, particularly for authors and web designers and entrepreneurs, that is amazing. Like, that really is something I think everyone should be more grateful for.
Oh yeah. And I know some people like to go into their offices, and that's great. I do miss sometimes working in an office and interacting with people, but some days I'm like, it's really nice to roll out of bed and just walk over to my computer and do my work.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I guess I definitely didn't mean to disparage anyone who goes to offices or likes doing that. But the fact that, even in that case, the fact that we're in a world where we can connect with anybody all over the world And even if you have a full-time job, I teach a lot of people who are running side hustles with web design. How cool, like how amazing that you don't need to get another job where you have to like go to a warehouse or go somewhere to work nights and not be home. You could still do stuff at home or on the weekends if you need to as a side hustle. That in itself is amazing. Like I guess, I don't know. I just really want to hit that idea of gratitude for the littlest things, because it really is. I think that's something that a lot of people tend to overlook, is those little celebrations. And the simplest thing, again, to a family with kids with no feeding struggles, is that's, for us, that's amazing. That's a win. That's incredible. So I love that you brought that up, because that's a great point, the celebrations. Well, Crissy, this has been awesome. Seriously, you've given me such good, valuable thoughts to think on. And I know everyone listening is going to take a lot of value from this as it translates to their life personally and professionally, and particularly in web design. I have one final question for you, but before I ask you that, where would you like people to go to check you out? And of course, I'll link your book, The Too Tall Giraffe, in there, which is available on Amazon now, right?
Yes, it is available everywhere books are sold, pretty much.
Awesome.
Even in Target, which I was so excited about.
Oh, it's in Target? No kidding.
Yeah, I don't think it's in the store, but it's on the website. I was like, wow, that feels really big. But to learn more about me, thechristhinemaier.com, which is Christine, ChristhineMaier.com. Or if you want to go the simple way, the tootallgiraffe.com. You can find out about the book, and you'll find the rest of me on there too.
Perfect. Yeah. And we'll link both of those in the show notes. Definitely encourage everyone to check out the book, particularly if you have kids. It's a great little read. We had fun reading that. It's a precious little story. Again, I don't want to give it all away, but the idea of focusing on your strengths and using a weakness as a potential superpower, I just love that idea. It's something that resonates with me, with what we're going through. My final question for you, Crissy, is if somebody is going through something, maybe not exactly like you have, but they're in a hardship, or they're in, just a tough position. What's maybe one thing that helped you get through that, or one thing to focus on?
Ooh, good question. I think it's that, back to that question where I would ask myself or tell myself, there's a lesson here. You don't know what it is yet, but you're going to find out down the road, and it's going to make you a better, stronger person.
Well said. That's perfect. And can I follow you up with one final question?
Yes.
Would you, as somebody who has, gone through some surgeries and dealt with cleft palate and cleft lip and stuff, if you could tell Bria, my daughter, something, what would you tell her just to encourage her to embrace her superpowers? Maybe I'll share this with her later on when she recognizes.
That she is beautiful and she is unique. And if we all looked the same and we all acted the same, life would be very boring. And so she's the one who's making the world interesting.
Oh, that's awesome. You just gave me chills. Too good. Crissy, thank you so much for that. I will show Bria that when she can take that in and fully recognize it. Of course, the podcast is all archived and it's always out there. So I can't wait to show her that. Thank you so much, Crissy, for coming on and for sharing some really valuable tips, for being so transparent and real. And just thank you for, sharing your journey and your life experience and turning a lot of this stuff into inspiration for people. I love it. I'm so glad Renee connected us, and I'm excited to see how this helps folks not only in business, but in personal life with getting through a lot of this stuff. I'm definitely feeling inspired and pumped up by a lot of the lessons you've dished out here. So thank you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Josh.
Hey guys and gals, just wanted to pop in with a couple things before you head out. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this podcast. I would love to hear your feedback, and it will also help other web designers find the show. Be sure to check out the show notes for this episode. Just go to joshhall.co, click on podcasts, and search this episode number, and you'll find all the links, descriptions, and resources we talked about. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, and you'll be notified when the next episode is live. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys on the next episode.